everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I have an exciting knitting project that you won't want to miss. We're going to create a chic, solid color hat featuring a cozy brim, a smooth stockinette stitch, and a neat 3-needle bind off. The best part? This hat knits up super quickly. So grab your yarn and needles and let's get started. For this project, you will need 1 skein of either red, white, or blue yarn. You can choose a yarn that is in a size 4, medium weight, or you can choose something that is bulky, like a size 6, or you could even choose something that's thinner, like a DK weight. This is a double Sunday from Sandnes Garn. So lots of different choices. All of your pattern options will be in the description below. Depending on the yarn you choose and the needles you choose, you will end up with a different type of hat. So our instructions are all the same either way. Our measurements are the same either way. All of the hats have a brim and a stockinette stitch part. You will also need knitting needles in the round, the appropriate size for the yarn that you choose. In the instructions, I've written it for a size 7 needle, a size 8 needle, and a size 11 needle, all 16-inch in the round. You'll need a sharp pair of scissors, a stitch marker, I really like this cat one, a tapestry needle with a nice large eye, and I like the kind that has a turned point on the end, and a tape measure. You will also need 1 extra knitting needle. This one's in the round. It could be straight. It needs to be 1 size larger than the knitting needles you're using to knit your hat, and this will be used for the 3-needle bind off at the end when we seam the top of the hat. If you are a beginner knitter and have never picked up knitting needles before, I will give you a section of this video that will show you how to knit, how to purl, and how to join in the round. If you are familiar with knitting, then go ahead and jump right straight through to the project. For the project I'm showing today, I am using the size 4 weight yarn. This is an Impeccable from Michaels, and I have a size 8 knitting needle in a 16-inch round. And because of those sizes, I will cast on 92 stitches. And I like to use the long tail cast on, and I start with even my slip stitch in the long tail cast on. So I just start by bringing the needle down onto the top of the yarn, turning my hand over the thumb, over by my forefinger, and then coming up to form my first stitch. So we'll go ahead and cast on 92 stitches for this project. If you are a beginner, go back to the area of the video that has all the explanations and details for how to get started. So I'll see you back here once you have 92 stitches on your needle for joining in the round. I have 92 stitches cast on my needle. The very first thing I want to do is begin to straighten these stitches out on the needle. And you can see that there are twists in here. The idea is that you want to get everything straightened so that you don't have any twists in your stitching. So let's just take a moment and get everything nice and straight. And you can pull these stitches all the way to the end of the needle, which is helpful in getting everything in the same way. What I'm trying to do is get all of the knitting to the back side of the needle and keep all of the loops on on the inside of the needle, and that helps me to spot check and see that I have everything now straight. There's no twisting in my needle. So now I have 92 stitches and we need to join in the round, but I want to get a nice, secure, tight join in that round. So what I'm going to do is just add one extra cast on stitch. So this would be a 93rd cast on stitch. Now paying attention that all of my stitches are still straight, nothing's twisted. This is where you want to go ahead and take as much time as you need, because unfortunately, if you do join in the round and something is twisted, you have to take it back out. So I say take as much time as you need to get it done right. Okay, so now we're going to take this very first stitch purlwise and bring it over. And I say very first stitch. It's the one on your right needle. It's the first stitch that you cast on. So we are going to take him over here to the right needle where our last 93rd stitch was cast on. Now using that right needle, I'm going to lift this stitch up and over that back stitch. That essentially takes this stitch right off the needle. So I only have 92 stitches on my needle, and then I'm going to take these ends and just give them a little tightening, and that is going to bring my join nice and tight together. So now I'll do one more check to make sure everything is still nice and straight, exactly the way that it is supposed to be. And we'll go ahead and get started. Since I just added that 93rd stitch, I do need to flip my needles over, and I'm going to get my tail out of the way because frequently I can accidentally knit with my tail. So I just take it and tie, kind of turn it over a couple times and tie a knot. And that keeps it out of my way and makes it so that I do not knit by accident with that piece. Now that we have 92 stitches on, I'm going to mark the beginning of my round with a stitch marker. And then I'm just going to go right into my knit 2, purl 2 pattern. I'm going to knit 1, knit 2, and then purl 2. And we are going to do this for about 3 inches of the brim of the hat. Now I've done a little bit of measuring and I've made a couple of hats, and I found that between 7 and 8 inches is about the right size for a hat. So I knit the brim or the ribbing for about 3 inches, and then the remainder is the stockinette stitch, which is when you just knit in the round, for about 4 to 4.5 inches, depending on who I'm knitting it for. I'll give it a little try on for them, and then we'll get the right size. Okay, so you can look for clues in your knitting. You can see here that I have 2 knit stitches, 2 purl stitches, 2 knit stitches, 2 purl, 2 knit. And as I come all the way around, 92 is divisible by 4. Our knit 2, purl 2 is a 4 stitch repeat. So when you come up to your stitch marker, you should have purl 2 so that you can go right into knit 2. Okay, so go ahead and get started and get a few rounds on your needles. All right, and I am coming up to the end of this first row, and I am at a purl 2. So there's 1 and 2. And then you'll just take your stitch marker, flip it right over, and keep on going. Get those stitches up there, And now you begin this next round, and you're going to knit 2, purl 2. Same thing for 3 inches. And if it's easier than trying to remember, oh, I'm knitting, I'm purling, look for those purl bumps, and those will remind you that that's where your purl stitches go, then your knit stitches, then your purl stitches. Okay, so I'll meet you back here when you have about 3 inches of knit 2, purl 2 on your needles. Okay, so I have about a little over 3 inches, well, maybe just 3 inches of knit 2, purl 2. It's kind of nice because if you wanted to turn this up, you could, but you don't need to. Adding a nice thick rib gives your hat a little bit of stability when you're wearing it on your head. When I'm using the finer, the size 7 or the size 8, I like the ribbing to go a little higher. On the bulky size, I let the ribbing be about 2 inches because it just makes up very square. So this one just didn't need as much strength in its structure. So 3 inches of that knitting, the knitting and purling does perfectly. And then we're going to go ahead and put in a knit round. So now that we've got this in, we'll just go ahead and knit all the way around. All right, we'll slip that marker over, and now we're just going to knit, 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 knit. You want to imagine that as you're wearing your hat, your head is going to be fitting inside of your hat. So if you measure from the top of the hat, you know, and use a flexible tape measure, this is why I love these. Use a flexible tape measure and kind of give yourself an idea for how long you think you'd like your hat to be. What I'm referring to when I'm talking about measuring your hat is you take your measuring tape and just go to the top of your head, because I know my hat, I want my hat to be there, and I want my hat to be, you know, right down here under my ear. So if I measure that, I get about 9.5 inches. And then also as you're knitting, I know we're using 16-inch knitting needles, but as you're knitting, if you have an extra set of knitting needles, just go ahead and put your stitches onto another knitting needle, and you can try your hat on. You just slip it right on. You'll know when you're getting to the right spot on your head. And when you can kind of feel like you can pinch it and there's enough space that you've got your little ears sticking out, that's about where you stop. This hat itself measures, and I think I consistently make mine about 7.5 inches long. So I would say if this was 4.5 inches of knitting stockinette stitch, you're just knitting, 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 knitting every row all the way around. Okay? So I will meet you back here after you have all of your knitting completed, and we'll do a 3-needle bind off. Here we are at the end of the knitting. This measures about 7.25 inches from the top to the brim, maybe 7.5. Now that we've got this finished, what we want to do is a 3-needle bind off, because I can take off my stitch marker now, because what we're doing is turning everything to the side. So our back around is now going to be our side, and we're going to seam across the top. This is where you need the extra knitting needle. It doesn't have to be the same size as what you're using. In fact, a little bit bigger is good. So let me grab mine and we'll be right back here. I am going to use knitting needles that are one size up. So I'm knitting with a size 8. And for this, I am going to use a size 9. Okay. So here is what we are going to do. The yarn is on the back needle. And where the stitches are over here does not matter because we're going to be working everything up towards the front here. And we're using our third needle to essentially knit the stitch from the front needle to the one on the back needle. And I am going to elect to have the seam right on the outside. You could choose to put it on the inside. Let me show you what it looks like when you're finished. This is the seam across the front of the hat, across the back. It just looks like a purl row. So we'll go ahead, line up our stitches here, get our extra needle. Now this is a round needle, so I'm just going to ignore this part that's back here. And we're just going to go through the front 2 stitches, get our yarn, and knit those stitches together. Next, we'll take the next 2 stitches, knit them together. And now we have 2 stitches on the needle, on our right hand needle. So the back loop is going to come up over the front loop and off the needle entirely. So I'm just going to use this back needle here. And you want to be careful not to split your fiber as you're doing that. And I'm just taking that back stitch right off over the front. So we'll go ahead, knit, and then this back stitch comes off over the front. Take those 2 stitches, the back loop comes off over the front. And you can start to see that little seam appearing there. So you'll just keep knitting and going right down the top of your hat to bind off your seam. The looser you keep that stitch right there, the looser your seam across the top will be. If you feel like it's getting too tight, just loosen up how you're holding those stitches. So, and you can give it a little bit of a pull as you're coming out to give it a nice little loop right there. Before we go meet each other at the end of this seam, it's important for me to tell you how to get your stitches to keep going up to the top of the needle. You're just going to take the end part of your round knitting needle and just push it through randomly. Doesn't matter where it goes. You can, as you get along down the end, you'll count your stitches and even this out. But for now, that allows the stitches to keep going towards the front where you're actually doing all of the work. I just want to show you how to reorganize your stitches if they are not even on each side. I don't think mine are. So you just take them, slide them back, and make sure this extra stitch that you have is protected. Not going to fall off, but then you'll count your stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I have 15 on here, 16 because of one over here. So I am going to count 8. 8 is going to be my half, but I'm going to leave the larger half on the back needle. We'll see how that plays out for me, but I think that's going to work out correctly. All right, slide everything up to the front here. Got the one needle there, and we'll just keep on going. Okay, and I'm down to the last few stitches here. these off. I have that one extra stitch on the back needle, so I'll just go ahead and knit through that one and then slide this back stitch over the front stitch, and then get my scissors. I can loosen that up and take that needle out. Get my scissors and give this a trim. And then pull that tail right through that loop. Oh, this looks cute. I really like this in white. All right, now we want to weave in the ends. So I'm going to get my tapestry needle, thread that. Okay, turn it right side around. And we can check out, this is even the back side of our seam. If you turn it over, that's the front side of our seam. Have fun and enjoy. And remember, you have the size 8 needle size, the size 7 needle size, and the size 11 needle size. So lots of choices within this pattern.
Hey there, crafty friends. Welcome to our cozy corner of creativity. Today, we'll learn how to tie a slip knot and cast on stitches. Then dive into forming knit and purl stitches. So grab your yarn and needles and let's get started. Before you know it, you'll be ready to knit your very own comfy hat.
First thing to do is to tie a slip knot. You'll simply turn the working end over the end that goes to the yarn, pinch that between your finger and your thumb, and then simply loop that end right up and you'll tie that knot. And there's your slip knot. And the reason it's called a slip knot is because this one end just moves freely back and forth. So you'll simply put that right onto your knitting needle and then tighten that right down, and that is how you start knitting. Now there is one other way to tie a slip knot. If you'd prefer, you can wrap the yarn around your 2 fingers and then bring that loop right up and you'll get a slip knot the same way. So whichever one works for you, either one is fine. So we're going to start by putting that slip knot onto the knitting needle.
Take a little time and practice tying slip knots with the 2 methods you just learned.
The long tail cast on. Now with this cast on, you do need to estimate the amount of yarn you need for the stitches you're going to cast on. To do that, all I have to do is take my yarn and wrap it around my knitting needle 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now I want to pinch this section right here and this section up here, because what that's going to do is tell me about how much yarn 10 stitches will take. Now I can then get a ruler and give it a little measurement to see that 10 stitches is about 9 inches. And then I'm going to give myself a little bit extra. So for 10 stitches, it's about 10 inches. So If I know I'm going to put 10 stitches onto my knitting needle, I'll give myself 10 inches of length on this end. And I'm going to give myself a little bit of length here and pull that out. And then I'm going to show you how to do the long tail cast on. So you're simply going to lay the yarn over your index finger and your thumb of your left hand. And then give that a pinch down at the bottom by your little finger. So all I've done is laid it right over and given it a pinch. Now I have the end of the yarn towards the front of my body and the tail that goes to the ball of the yarn towards the back. So you can see how that's set up. And I'm just going to take my knitting needle and push it down across the top. I'm going to come over this thumb, around my finger, and then I'll see a little bit of that tail sticking right up. And go ahead and tie my slip knot that way. The reason I do this is because it gives me the same stitch on the front of that slip stitch. It's not a different looking stitch, it's not a knot, it looks the same as everything else. So the next step is to put the yarn back over my thumb and forefinger, and now we're going to cast on. You're going to take your knitting needle by your thumb, up by your forefinger, and right through that little part right there. Down here by your thumb, up by your finger, and right through the loop. By your thumb, up by your finger, and right through the loop. By your thumb, up by your finger, and through the loop. Thumb, up by your finger, and through the loop. Do it one more time. By your thumb, up by your finger, and through the loop.
Remember, you can pause the video at any time and rewind to repeat a step if you still have questions or you just need to see the demonstration again. In this class, the goal is to practice your knit and purl stitches. We really aren't going to be making anything specifically. The idea really is to make a swatch and to practice your knit and your purl stitches. You will probably have to take some stitches out as you go along and re-knit. You might allow your mistakes to stay in the swatch that you're making. This really is about practicing. I always recommend for my students that they not worry about exactly what they're making at first, because we tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves if we're trying to make something specific. Whereas if you just allow yourself to practice, there's less pressure. So we'll put a little less pressure on ourselves and we'll just knit. We're just going to practice. Let's start by casting on 36 stitches. I'm going to use the long tail cast on method, and I'll give myself enough of a tail so that I can cast on those 36 stitches. Now, I don't always measure exactly how much I need, and I'm okay with that. If I end up with a little extra on the ends, I'm really all right with that. So I just pull out about what I think I need. And I'll start with the working end away from me and the tail end close to my body. My first cast on stitch comes down around my thumb, up by my finger, and through the triangle. And now we'll cast on 36 of these.
Now, once you have all 36 stitches on, we're going to remember that we have that knit stitch facing us and the purl stitch on this side. And that's okay, because the first stitch we're going to learn is a knitting stitch. And we're just going to knit all the sides on both of them. So I just want you to practice by knitting. Now, as you cast on your stitches, you do want to pay attention to how tight they are. You don't want to give it a death grip of a pull, because then you won't be able to do your knitting. It'll be too tight. You don't want it so loose that it falls off either. So you do have to practice a little bit to get that tension exactly where it should be. And if you have a tail like I do, you can either trim that off, or you can leave it long and tie it up a little bit. Because this is a swatch, I'm just going to trim mine off. You want to make sure you deal with that end so that you don't accidentally knit that into your project. It's happened to me before. Trust me, it will happen to you at some point, but give yourself a little bit of a break there and just tie it off. Okay, so to start knitting, the first thing we're going to do is slide the needle behind this first loop right here. Slide it right in there, and then grabbing the end that goes to the ball of yarn, come right over the back of the needle, and then bring that right up through the top and slide it right off the needle. And that's knitting. That's all there is to it. Just going to come around the back of that needle, up through the loop. Come back through the back of the needle and use those tips. The tips are tapered on your needles. You can slide that tip right along and you'll feel it. Come right along that other edge, slide it up, and then you're simply sliding that stitch right off. Slide that behind, around, slide that right up. So now we're going to go ahead and knit all the way across all 36 of the stitches and just practice. Go slow. As you get ready to, you want to go ahead and push those stitches right up to the edge of the tip. If they start to fall off, slide it back down. If one falls off, it's okay. Don't worry about it. If it, just keep right on going. Like I said, this is your practice. We're not going to try and fix anything yet. We're just going to practice. The best thing about knitting is that you're not going to mess up your material. If you don't like what you're doing, you're just going to pull it all out. It's just a bunch of knots. So if you don't like what you're doing, pull it out and start over again. Some people get upset about that, but I always feel like this is part of the learning process. And knitting is about the process. It's about the process of creating that relaxing time for yourself and just enjoying the knitting. So now, and you'll notice that I'm not focusing on how to tension your yarn right now or anything like that. We're just grabbing that yarn by the tips of our fingers and bringing it around. And that's because this is the easiest way to get started. So why don't you do a few rows of knitting and just practice. If you need to, you can put the video on pause and rewind and rewatch a section and just give yourself an opportunity to practice those knitting stitches. Now let me show you though how to turn around first. Let's get to this end here. all the way to the end. Now we'll do that last stitch, slide that right over, and you've knit your first row. Congratulations. Now the next thing you want to do is simply turn this around. You want to turn it. Now you know the end that you're knitting is right here to the ball of the yarn, and we're going to go ahead and knit a couple of rows. Same process as before. Just going to slide in and knit. So why don't you knit a couple of rows and meet me back right here. And your knitting should look something like this. This is what's called a garter stitch. Now when we're knitting, what we're doing is we're making a fabric. And the fabric will have a different look to it depending on the stitches that you do. We learned how to do the knit stitch, and we knit each side of our knitting. And we've created purl bumps on each side, which means that we've created a garter stitch fabric. Let me show you a piece of that a little further along, and you'll see that this fabric really has a very distinct look to it. It's all those purl stitches on both sides, and each side of the fabric looks the same because I've knit both sides. So if you just kept going with your piece and you wanted to, you could knit this into just a lovely scarf right on its own. It's a nice thick fiber and a nice warm scarf. So you could stop right here and make something if you wanted to. You're a knitter. Now we want to go a little further though, and I want to teach you the purl and the knit stitch. So these are the only two stitches in knitting. So let me show you a couple of things that change. Now here I've got another piece where I have done a little bit of that garter stitch, and then I've done a knit stitch on one side and a purl stitch on the other side. So now my fabric looks different. It has all those purl bumps on one side and knit stitches on the other side. And the important thing about doing a swatch is that you start with that little bit of garter stitch, and then we're going to leave some garter stitch along the sides so that when we're finished, our swatch sits nice and flat so that we can measure for gauge. All right, so let me show you a couple of things about what happens when you mix that knit and that purl stitch. Here's some other swatches that I've made, just mixing the knit and the purl stitch. Here's one. Here's what your finished swatch is going to look like. So you'll just practice that knitting and that purling, and the goal is to get your stitches to look as even as possible. Now, if you mix a knit stitch and a purl stitch, you end up with a piece of ribbing. Now, this is commonly found along the brim of a hat, or along the cuff of a sweater, or along the waist of a sweater. You'll find this in a lot of different places, and you can change how many purl and knit stitches you have, and that will create that rib, the thickness of your rib. So this again is identical on both sides because you're spreading out the knit and the purl. So if I pull this, you'll see that I have knit stitches right here and purl stitches right here. So that's kind of cool. And then when you start to play with your knitting and your purling, you can, this is just simply taking this stitch and adjusting where the knits and the purls line up. So in this one, I knit every 2 stitches and I purled every 2 stitches. On this one, I knit every stitch. On this one, I knit every other stitch and purled every other stitch. and then I just changed that as I went along. And what that does is create a whole different sort of fabric. So as you can see, just by learning these 2 stitches, you'll see different things coming off the bottom of your needles. So let's learn that purl stitch. It's not hard to do. It's really just knitting the knit stitch backwards. That's all it is. So we've turned our work, and we have our swatch down here with the garter stitch. I'm going to slide these stitches right up to the front. Now, because I want you to create a swatch which has those garter stitches on the sides as well, we're always going to knit the first 2 stitches and the last 2 stitches. Now, if you mess that up and you end up purling or doing whatever, it's perfectly all right. Don't worry about it. It's just a swatch. So we'll start by knitting 2 stitches, same as we've been doing. Knit 1, knit 2, and now we'll do a purl stitch. To do the purl stitch, you need to bring your yarn to the front of your work. When you're knitting, the yarn stays in the back of your work. Now we're purling, so it's going to come to the front. And I'm simply going to put that needle in and bring my yarn around over the top of the needle and around, and slide it right through. Let me show you again. Yarn over the top of the needle, and then what you're doing is sliding that tip and bringing it through and letting the stitch come right off that needle. It's literally the opposite of the knitting. So we're just coming right through, back, behind, and off. Do it one more time. Around the needle, back through, and off it goes. And we'll just purl all the way across this row. Now you can hold your knitting needles where it's comfortable for you. Generally, I hold my needles pretty close to my lap and just knit right in front of my hands. You can see that I am holding this needle steady. On my left side, I just hold that needle real steady, and the right side is doing all of the work. This other side, you can even balance the tip of that needle in your lap if you need to keep it steady. Now technically, purling is the back of your work and the knitting is the front of your work. So what we're doing is working across the back of the work. Okay, and we get to that end and we'll turn this around. And let's just take a quick look here, what we've done. You can see now that this looks a little bit different than those purl bumps. Now we have some knit stitches that are starting to come out. So this side we're going to knit because this is our knit side. Remember, we're going to knit those first 2 stitches and those last 2 stitches. And we'll just knit right across this row. you need to use your hand, your pointer finger, to point that needle down, that's fine. Get yourself into the rhythm and learn the movements first. Then you can learn how to pick up speed. Okay, we'll knit right to that end. And let's take a look at our work. It's always important when you get to the end of your row to take a look at your work, because if you have a mistake, you can fix it at this point very easily. So there we have our knitting and we have our purling. So we'll go right back around, and now we'll flip it over, and there's our purl row. So why don't you knit and purl a couple of rows, and then we'll come right back here and meet up again. In case you make a mistake, if you're going along and then you realize, oops, I knitted when I should have purled. It's okay. It's okay. It's so easy to undo. And I wish I had learned this early on in my knitting, because there's so many times I just ripped everything out because I just didn't know how to fix it. And it's not hard to fix. So I've made an error here. I purled instead of knitting. So all I'm going to do is take these 2 stitches and I'm going to slide them right off. Now you can see nothing bad happened. I dropped the stitches off. My whole piece didn't come unraveled. There's no disaster that happened. Everything's okay. I'm just going to pull this yarn out, and my little stitches are right there. See how nice and safe they are? They're still right there. So I'm just going to turn this over, and I'm going to put those stitches back onto my needle. And then I can go back to my stitching right here, and I can say, all right, I want to switch this yarn to the front so that I can do my knitting. And there we go. I fixed those 2 stitches. Now, the only thing that you probably need to pay attention to if you're going to undo some stitches is how to put the stitch back onto the needle, because there is a right and a wrong way to do that. If you can accidentally twist the stitch, which would then, you'll be able to see it right away, because see how evenly these stitches are formed? If by accident your stitch is twisted, you'll see a little twist right in there. And then you can go back and undo that. So how do the stitches sit on the needle? The front leg of the stitch should be right in the front, and the back in the back. If for some reason I had put this onto the needle the wrong way, it would simply be turned around so that it was the opposite way on the needle. And I would know this because when I go to put my stitch in, it would be a little bit tight. So I'll just take it off and turn it the right way. Now, if I want to go back and undo a lot of stitches, I can also do that by picking through them with the other needle tip. And all I would want to do on the purls is simply come up under that purl bump and slide that needle up and then slip my stitch back off. And then I can pull that right out and the stitch comes undone. So I'm just going to go right up here under that purl bump, slide that back onto my needle, slip that stitch off, and give it a pull, and that'll come right undone. Now I have a couple of knit stitches right here. Let's say I want to undo some of those knit stitches. I can come right into the V of that stitch and take it right off, lift it off, and then undo it. And it pops right off. So I can kind of come back and say, oops, I made a mistake. I need to go back 5 stitches, and I can come right in and I can undo my stitches if I'm at all concerned that I might drop it, and just go ahead and undo it. And then I know my, I have to flip this around to work it because my working yarn is always to the right. So here I am, I need to redo some stitches. Here I am with my purl bumps, so I know I'm purling. And I'll just put that needle in and go ahead and do my purling. Now this stitch, see, now here's a guy who's backwards. This stitch is backwards, and I can tell because it's twisted and it's a little hard to get my needle in there. So I'm simply going to lift this off and just turn it right around and put it back onto the right spot and do my stitch. So I might have twisted when I went to take these off, I twisted a couple of them. So I'm just going to take them off and put them back on properly and then go ahead and do my stitch. So I'll lift him off, turn him around, and now I can stitch. And these are twisted too. So we'll just pop it right around. Now I'm ready to do my knitting. I'm going to slide this needle to the back of my work. Go in to do my knit stitch. He's backwards too. Flip him around. Slide right in and do that knit stitch. So see how easy it is to fix our mistakes? It's not hard. It's really easy to do, and you don't need to panic or be worried. This is our swatch, so practice going back, taking a couple stitches out, putting them back on, making sure they're not twisted stitches, and see how you do. It's a really, really important thing to practice very, very early on so that you become a confident knitter.
Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your knitting creations in the comments below. Happy knitting, everyone. See you next time.